Due to the following CBS School Break special, Magnum PI will not be seen today. It will be broadcast tomorrow in the regular time period.
Word Balloon is brought to you by the League of Word Balloon Listeners. This episode of Word Balloon is brought to you by AlexRossArt.com. Alex is a brand new graphic novel coming out from Marvel and Abrams Books. Fantastic Four, Full Circle. It comes out September 6th. It's a rainy night in Manhattan, and not a creature is stirring except for the Thing, Ben Grimm. When an intruder suddenly appears inside the Baxter Building, the Fantastic Four find themselves surrounded by a swarm of invading parasites. These carrion creatures, composed of negative energy, come to Earth using a human host as a delivery system. But for what purpose? And who is behind this untimely invasion? The Fantastic Four have no choice but to journey to the negative zone, an alien universe comprised entirely of antimatter, risking not just their own lives, but the fate of the cosmos. Fantastic Four, Full Circle is the first long-form work written and illustrated by acclaimed artist Alex Ross, who revisits a classic Lee Kirby story from the 60s and introduces the storyline for a new generation of readers. Bold, vivid colors, his trademark visual storytelling, Ross takes Marvel's first team of superheroes to places only he can illustrate. The book also features a special poster jacket with the front flap unfolding to reveal an all-new, fully painted origin story of the Fantastic Four. Again, Fantastic Four, Full Circle, out September 6th. For more details, go to AlexRossArt.com. Welcome back, everybody. Time again for Word Balloon, the comic conversation show. We usually talk comic books, but every now and then we dip into comedy. John Suntress here. Very happy to welcome Dan Pasternack to Word Balloon, a longtime fan on my part. I've enjoyed his work, and he has a brand new comedy interview podcast you need to be aware of, and that is OCD, Obsessive Comedy Disorder or Comic Disorder?
Obsessive Comedy Disorder.
Of course it is. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you, John Suntress. Thank you for having me. I'm using my big podcast/radio voice.
And I love that you're holding onto the microphone. That's very Borscht Belt and kind of classic. I feel like I'm at Kutcher's right now in the audience and stuff, and you're going to start ripping me.
What? What are you kidding at me over here with that?
Dan, I am a comedy history nerd, and I love the fact, because we're close to the same age, but I love that you go way back. And in fact, I was just telling you, and I've told you many times, one of my favorite things that I've discovered online are the Academy of Television oral history interviews. And you did several of really great interviews, like Milton Berle and Sid Caesar. And forgive me, I don't remember the gentleman's name, but he was one of the last surviving cast members of Amos and Andy, the TV show.
Yes, Nick Stewart.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Who was
Wow.
lightning on not only lightning on Amos and Andy, but he was also the voice of Brer Bear in Disney's Song of the South. Try and pick which of those two credits is more controversial now.
Wow. Yeah, no kidding. I know it. And truly, I appreciate, Dan, and we'll get into it, that where comedy is now, and also the way that older comedy is looked at, today's society is not as, I don't even know the correct word, not necessarily forgiving, but understood the context of what came before, and it worries me sometimes. And it's a subject that you got into with John Cleese, your first two episodes. Fantastic talk with John. Unbelievable stuff. And then your most recent interview that dropped this week, W. Kamau Bell. And again, it isn't the main thrust of your conversations. I should also mention your great co-host, Paul Provenza, who's another comedian that I've enjoyed. And also his times, wasn't his show The Green Room, one of his TV shows?
Yes, he had a Showtime series, The Green Room, which was fantastic. And you can still find them. I think Showtime still has them on demand, and I think you can find them online. Unbelievably great roundtable show of comedians just being as real and as themselves and as true to, the actual dynamic that takes place when a group of comics really gets together and hangs out. is replicated so beautifully on that show. It's one of my favorite things Paul has ever done, and I'm proud and privileged to have been present for a few of the first episodes that were shot of that show, and in fact helped him put together one of the panels in the first season of that show, which was Paul with Robert Klein, Rick Overton, and my dear friend Jonathan Winters.
Wow. Yes, we'll talk about Jonathan Winters. Mentioning Robert Klein, Robert performs your theme song on OCD.
He does.
And I think that's terrific. I'm a longtime fan of all these guys, including Jonathan Winters as well. Provenza also co-produced The Aristocrats.
He did. He co-directed it with Penn Jillette. Penn will also be a guest on an upcoming episode.
That's great to hear. Man, I really think the timing of that movie was good because it kind of came ahead of the cancel culture wave. And certainly The Aristocrats is kind of this infamous joke. Anyone who isn't aware of it, look it up, everybody. I'm sure there are great examples on YouTube of people telling this obviously filthy joke that is meant to be shocking. And again, I mean, that's part of the joke, is that it's this unbelievable story.
Well, it was an infamous joke that was only ever told really in private by comedians to comedians. And, I think Paul's thesis, if there was a thesis when he and Penn set out to make the movie, was, it's not the song, it's the singer. And it really was about almost what each comic revealed about themselves in their own interpretive improvisational telling of that joke. I mean, the first time I ever heard it was from Milton Berle sitting at the table at the Friars Club.
Awesome.
It was the first time I'd ever heard of the joke, let alone heard the joke. And Milton's version went on for about 7.5 minutes and was every bit as filthy as you would imagine it would be.
That's outstanding. Oh man, I really envy you. Are you a member of the Friars Club?
I was very, very briefly. This is when I lived in Los Angeles, and I used to go to the Beverly Hills Friars Club,
Wow.
which was where Milton used to hold court. It no longer exists, but yeah, I mean, my very first time ever walking in the door of the Friars Club was to have lunch with Milton. And I sat at the table with he and his writer, Buddy Arnold, and Henny Youngman. And, the parade of, all the great alta-cockers that you would imagine were there. So, but that was, many years ago. I've since, gone to the New York Friars on several occasions. And in fact, I've even shot some interviews for the TV Academy's archive at the New York Friars, most recently with my good friend Alan Zweibel.
Oh, that's terrific. Alan Zweibel for Comic Novices, great collaborator with Gilda Radner, SNL writer, among other things. Gary Shandling. It's Gary Shandling Show, the Showtime show.
John, you know your stuff.
Hey, man.
I'm not messing with kids here.
God bless you, man, because truly, and also, I literally, in my brain, I'm a Greek guy, but grew up with many Jewish friends, so I've learned my share of Yiddish. And when you said alter cocker, I'm like, that's exactly the phrase that's in my head. I'm so glad he said that. Now, give me the proper, what does that translate to? Like funny old man, crazy old man? What is an alter cocker?
Yeah, an alter cocker is just like it's almost like an old person that you can kind of like, for the people listening in audio only, you kind of like wave your hand like, oh, that old guy over there, he's an alter cocker,
I do.
There's always like a corresponding hand gesture because we're a very demonstrative people, let's just say. So there's always there's always a hand gesture that goes with most things you say in Yiddish.
The old Greeks are the same way, man. And again, this is what I love about the universality of so many things, like My Big Fat Greek Wedding, as far as examining my people, tremendous, a lot of Neil Simon stuff, certainly a lot of his Brighton Beach Memories and Broadway Bound and all those plays and films that, talk about the immigrant experience of coming over here. and having, family that was from the old world with the younger generation. Even the most recent example that I loved was Canadian television, that Kim's Convenience show.
Mhm.
That was the South Korean immigrant experience going to Toronto. But
So interesting you bring up that because so the next episode of Obsessive Comedy Disorder, the podcast that is dropping, is it features the sort of central idea, the organizing principle is Bugs Bunny, and the way the episode plays out, Provenza and I have an interview with Eric Bauza. Eric Bauza is the current voice of Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck and Tweety Bird and Marvin the Martian and a bunch of those old Looney Tunes characters. And Eric is Canadian, but he's first generation Canadian. He's actually, his family on both his mother and father's side are Filipino. So he is very much of that kind of immigrant background where I find a lot of people who have that talent for mimicry are harnessing that thing that my dad had as a first generation American Jew with all that like Eastern European history that so many sort of Ashkenazi Jews who immigrated to the United States 100 years ago have, which is that ear, because you're picking up on the dialects of your people, all of the other sort of immigrant cultures around you, and there's a kind of facility for being able to sort of pick up on that music and replicate it. And I wrote a piece actually, this has got to be 5 or 6 years ago now, for Paste magazine, about the history of dialect comedy and how I saw it specifically in sort of the first half of the 20th century as an art form largely practiced by newly immigrated or first generation American Jews who were, again, drawing on all of that. And so we do this Bugs Bunny episode on Obsessive Comedy Disorder, the podcast, available where all of your fine podcasts are found. And so we have this conversation with Eric, intercut with a 40-year-old interview that I did in 1983 with my dear friend Mel Blanc when I was 14 years old.
Wow.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. Oh my God. There you go. Mel Blanc. I grew up loving him, obviously, from the cartoons, but also, as I'm sure you were, old time radio buff, would hear him on Jack Benny, Professor LeBlanc, Frenchman, a million different dialects. June Foray. I love the way now people refer to Mel Blanc as the male June Foray, as opposed to the opposite, because everyone gives it up to June because she was still doing it well into her 90s.
She was. I met June a number of times, and in fact, even got to sit in a booth and watch her work. And she was, by the way, I'm using my thumb and my forefinger to illustrate for those listening only on audio, this big. She was tiny, but had an amazing set of vocal cords, as did Mel. Oh yeah, and this might also be of interest, by the way. This is separate and apart from all of the comedy stuff that is relevant to my podcast. But for your specific listeners, I knew a lot of these old time radio actors, and in fact, the best man at my wedding, a man who called himself my surrogate grandfather, was the voice of Batman on the Super Friends, Olin Soule. And the man who, by the way, presided over my wedding, this is in 1993, so the man who officiated the wedding was also the writer of most of the episodes, or certainly more than anybody else, the writer of many episodes of the Batman TV series starring Adam West. Stanley Ralph Ross was this great writer, great comedy writer, also made a ton of great comedy records. Fascinating guy. Also did an interview with him for the TV Academy.
Yes.
And so Stanley officiated the wedding, and standing right next to me was in his 80s at the time, Olin Soule, who in his, I think up until he was in his 70s, was the voice of Batman to his Robin, played by Casey Kasem.
Yep. Great stuff, man. And Olen Soule, you can see on camera, was John, the hotel manager, and the choir director on the old Andy Griffith show.
Very good. That's correct.
And it is so great to see. It's just like in radio days when Wallace Shawn plays the Masked Avenger, and it's little schlubby Wallace Shawn, but fear not, evildoers. And you see Olen Soule, and he looks like, a guy you'd check out library books from and stuff.
Yeah, Olin, one of his favorite anecdotes was when he moved from Chicago. He was a big Chicago guy. He was actually from La Harpe, Illinois. And when he sort of established himself as this really sort of powerful voiced leading man in radio, very prominently on a show that was called the First Nighter program. He was always the leading man, always kind of like a hunky, virile, romantic leading man. He moved to California, and, he was 5'9" at best. And I think at his heaviest was 135 pounds, always wore big horn-rimmed glasses. And I think he was buying like patio furniture, I want to say. I hope I'm not butchering this story, Olin, sorry. But he was buying some patio furniture, and the man, is filling out all the paperwork as Olin's purchasing the stuff. And he says, "What's your name?" "Olin Soule." And he looks at the guy's name, and he looks at him, and he really scrutinizes him, like, "Olin Soule from the radio, Olin Soule." He goes, "Yes." And the guy looks him up and down. He goes, "Well, I don't mind telling you I'm disappointed."
I've had that experience myself, 30 years in Chicago radio. And Mark Miller, who wrote Kick-Ass and the Kingsman original comic books that were developed into movies, when he first met me, he's like, "John, based on your voice, I was expecting a much older man. You've got a Walter Cronkite kind of quality to your voice." And I was dying. I'm like, "Well, I'm, decades younger, but thank you. That's a nice compliment. So thank you. But yeah, a lot of us have faces for radio. Believe me, I'm well aware. That's awesome. And again, the guy, like you said, for a generation, I mean, those Super Friends cartoons are remembered very fondly. He was a great Batman. He was a terrific, and Casey was a great Robin. And I love that Casey had a big radio career prior to, and not just as, of course, the great DJ, American Top 40, but also a radio actor at the tail end. I mean, he was doing like Lone Ranger and Green Hornet shows in Detroit, because that's where WXYZ was, which was the place that the Lone Ranger and the Green Hornet and a couple other great adventure kid shows were created.
And most of those people went into animation. And so that's how Olin and Mel knew each other, and were good friends from radio and animation. And yeah, I mean, Casey also famously was in the original cast of Scooby-Doo.
Absolutely. Shaggy, the original Shaggy, no question. Zoiks. Absolutely. I had the pleasure of interviewing Tim Matheson, and it was, one of the reasons why I wanted to get him was he was the original Johnny Quest on the cartoons. And for a kid working with all those great old voice actors and comedians,
right.
And I'm like, you got to tell me everything. And I would say the same thing to you and ask you, because I was really surprised to learn that as early as 16, you started comedy writing, right?
Yes. So I was, I'm very fortunate. I always say I had geography on my side. So I grew up in Los Angeles, and this is all I've ever wanted to do. I mean, not that I had a family that was in the business. My mom was in retail. She was a manager of a department store, and my dad was a CPA. Okay. But it was all around,
Sure.
And I think my parents certainly understood that it was a business, so they were very supportive of my creative pursuits. And in fact, my mom, who was always a real pragmatist, was like, "Listen, if this is what you want to do, it's great. It's clear you have some facility for it. It's what you love. That's wonderful. You should pursue what you love. But how is it a business?" And so I was an intern, a studio intern for Paramount Pictures when I was 16. And during that summer, I began going to a lot of comedy clubs because I became friends with people who worked in casting at Paramount.
Okay.
And so I started meeting a lot of comedians because casting people would be talking to the people at the clubs, and I'm sitting with them. Who's this guy? I'm with them. Oh, okay. But because I'd been a fan for so many years at that point, I mean, I grew up on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, and
Sure.
really, I can't say this strenuously enough, was completely devoted to and educated by the Dr. Demento radio show. Um, and that's a whole other part of my story that, like, we could take that off ramp for an hour. But I knew all of these comics, and so in conversation with them, I could reference a spot they'd done on the Merv Griffin show, or something I'd seen them do prior, and I could make reference to a joke and maybe say something funny or offer a tag if it occurred to me. And finally, one comic, a guy named Jimmy Brogan, still a friend of mine, said, if comics are going to use these jokes that you're throwing out like so many pennies, people actually get paid for that. Like, oh, I didn't know, but that sounded good to me. I was 16 and I needed money. So I started writing jokes for comics, and then those comics, because it was the comedy boom, and there was a proliferation of clubs everywhere, they were all burning through material because they were all going on TV and they were all going on the road. And they would say, that joke's not right for me. You should do that joke. If you come on the road with me, I can get you, a gig doing, 10 minutes opening for me, and then we can write all week. And so I sort of, without it ever being my intention, was writing for comics and doing stand-up,
Wow.
from 16 forward. And Olin Soule, in fact, who, again, like my surrogate grandpa, and really, my great advocate, from the time I was about 13 when I first met him.
Wow.
He was getting ready to do a Bob Hope special as an actor, and had mentioned to Cy Jacobs, who was one of Hope's longtime writers, that I was writing all these jokes that were being used on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson by all of these young and up-and-coming comedians. And Cy Jacobs said, well, let me see a few pages of his stuff. I didn't know what a joke packet was, but I took, a bunch of pages of jokes that I'd sold and put them together. And he went, this is good stuff. And they offered me 2 days' work on a Bob Hope special called Bob Hope Buys NBC. This is 1985. For Block and Tape, I got to be a writer, just pitching jokes, punching stuff up. Learned a great life lesson, by the way, on that special. So Olin is on the special. It's obviously a very important person to me. I'm there working. But in my capacity, I don't really understand hierarchy, pecking order, reporting structures. I just think I'm there to come up with jokes. So I'm standing backstage with Olin. Now, the concept of the show was Bob Hope Buys NBC. This is when this was kind of a new phenomenon, and these, sort of media corporate takeovers were a thing, right?
Right.
So Bob Hope is trying to buy NBC, and at the very end of the special, he meets the current owner of NBC, R.C. Victor IV, played by Olin Soule. Now, Olin at that time was in his 70s, and even though he was slight and looked his age, he was actually pretty robust guy. So they wanted to make him look a little bit more frail, let's say.
Okay.
So they put some white in his hair, and gave him a cane to walk with. Olin never walked with a cane till the day he died. Was a perfectly ambulatory man. But the joke was that this frail, fragile seeming old man was actually like 20-something years old, but owning NBC had aged him so terribly. So that was a big joke. The reveal of him was this big joke. And so I'm standing backstage behind the flats with Olin. This is when we're shooting, by the way. This is not for like rehearsal. This is like audience out there, cameras are ready. They're going to shoot this thing. I remember Walter Miller was the director, who I later met again. I remember having this conversation with him because he was not expecting this. But I said to Olin, why don't you do like a heavy palsy shake? I said, I think it'll be funny and it'll really sell the idea that you're this decrepit old man.
Sure.
And so I'm coaching Olin not only on the shake, but how it will inform, the way he punches certain jokes. And Olin was a great comic actor. As you pointed out, he was John Masters on the Andy Griffith Show. He had been on the Jack Benny Show. He had been on Burns and Allen. Like, he did comedy really well.
Yeah.
So anyway, one of the other sporting actors says to Mr. Hope, would you like to meet the current owner of NBC? He said, sure, I would love to. Door opens and Olin comes in. He is shaking. He's looking, confused. He's sort of, eyes darting this way and that. He gets a huge round of applause just on his entrance. And no one was expecting it. I mean, not Hope, not the writers, not the director. So they're covering it. I think Hope even ad-libbed a couple of jokes, but Olin stole the scene. Now, look, there are some comedians, Jack Benny leaps to mind, who love when people around them get the laugh. Bob Hope was not one of those comedians. I mean, famously, I'd heard stories about if someone got a laugh in rehearsal on a joke, they came back for the show, they didn't have the joke anymore. Hope had the joke. So as Olin would say in interviews until his dying day after that show, he said it was the last time either Dan or I worked for Bob Hope.
Wow. Oh, my God. That's fantastic. I love hearing when Letterman is interviewed or others, and you really get behind some of those Hope specials. And listen, Bob Hope is absolutely a comedy icon. Sure. As you say, though, however, he did have that tick where he had to have the laugh. And it was fascinating to learn that a lot of those monologues that would open a Hope special were taped on the Tonight Show set. And I know that, like, literally they would tell the audience, and correct me if I'm wrong, hey, if you want to stick around, Bob Hope's going to do his after the taping of the Tonight Show, Bob is going to do his monologue if you want to be there. Well, not only would they use the Tonight Show audience, but also they would juice and punch up the laughs and take laugh tracks from Johnny's monologue and juice them into. And I forget who I had heard talk about this on one of their podcasts, that someone saw that Hope was not getting jokes or laughs from his monologue. But then afterwards, when the special aired, great, gregarious laughs. You could hear Ed McMahon laughing, whether he was really there laughing live with Hope or because it was, the Tonight Show. You can't miss that, kind of laugh. And that's fascinating. Also, you mentioned Milton. I know there was I want to say a YouTube thing, or maybe it was audio of when Milton was going to be on the Muppet Show, and he's going over with a comedy writer, different like stock jokes that he was going to do, comebacks, snappy comebacks to the Muppets or whatever. And that was really fascinating. I
don't know that I've ever seen or heard that.
I'm reasonably certain it's on YouTube. I'll try and search for it, Dan.
I would love to see or hear that if that's around. Yeah.
But that DNA behind these comedians and what was really going on to achieve the effect that they had when they were on when it was on TV.
Yeah, well, Milton was certainly that way. I mean, to the very end, I had a little brief window. I first met Milton when I was a comic, but I had a little brief window before my first job as a TV executive where I was actually Milton's agent.
Wow.
And one of the couple of great stories, if you're interested.
Sure.
But one of the fondest and most vivid memories was when I booked Milton to play himself on an episode of The Critic, if you remember the animated show The Critic.
Absolutely.
And Milton had wanted to punch up the script and add, some of his own jokes. And because I'd been a joke writer and he knew me as a comic and a joke writer, he said, Dan, you come over to my place tomorrow morning and we'll add jokes before, I think it was, the showrunner was, if I'm not mistaken, Mike Reese.
Right, Mike Reese and Al Jean. Yeah.
And I think Mike came over to Milton's condo there at the Wilshire Corridor and recorded it. And but earlier that morning, I'd gone over to help Milton punch up the script and add jokes. And when I got there, Milton was not a morning person. Yeah, I mean, comics are nocturnal by nature. And so when I got there, Milton was in a robe, seated in his chair where he would sit and smoke cigars, no underwear.
Yikes.
Knees like in 2 separate time zones, okay?
Spread eagle.
Now, I'm sure you're familiar with the legend of Milton Berle.
His appendage, yes, notorious.
Well, I had never seen it until this moment. So I walked in, and there it was. And John, I will just tell you, because I was aware of it, in the moment, I audibly swooned. I was like, Milton,
kind of famous. Yeah.
And then we added some jokes to the script, and later that day he recorded his episode of The Critic. Now, Milton's endowment, as he would refer to it, was so famous that at some point he and I came up with a story that we wanted to pitch to Gary Shandling for the Larry Sanders Show.
Okay.
I had actually turned Milton on to the Larry Sanders Show, which was pretty new when in the early 90s when I'm representing him, this was kind of a new thing. But I said, you have to watch the show. It's funny in a whole completely different way. And Milton was hip. He got it. I mean, I think that, often Milton, I think, gets kind of a bad rap with younger comics who think of him as this corny, shticky, Uncle Milty guy. And he certainly had those instincts. But he also really appreciated comedy of all genres and eras. Even if he wasn't the most masterful practitioner of it, he got it, and he got why it was good. And so he got what Shandling was doing. And so we came up with this idea that Milton had, Artie, who was played by Rip Torn, had worked for Milton at the beginning of his TV career. Artie was the veteran grizzled producer of the Larry Sanders Show, sort of loosely based on Freddie DeCordova, who was Johnny Carson's producer and had worked with Jack Benny in early TV. And
Birds and Allen. Yeah.
So yeah. So Rip Torn played this sort of grizzled old, hard drinking, hard talking, take no prisoner, son of a bitch, bastard kind of TV producer. But he, had begun his career in sort of our pitch working for Milton, and trembled at the sight of Milton because Milton was, to some, thought of as kind of this tyrant when he was Mr. Television. And the biggest star in early live TV. But that Shandling wanted to have him on because he knew about the legend of Milton's appendage. And that he was going to spend the entire episode trying to burst in so he could see it. And that in the pitch, and we came up with this whole thing, just Milton and I, that at some point he just throws up on the door and jumps in because he thinks Milton is getting undressed, and he gives Milton a heart attack, and he's being taken out on a stretcher, being put in the ambulance, and he looks under the blanket. The ambulance, he says to the ambulance driver, hang on a second, looks under the ambulance, and you just see the last shot is him reacting. And that would be, so we pitched this to Shandling. And anyway, it's funny because I've had just in the last year conversations with 2 different people who were aware that this call had transpired. One, my friend Judd Apatow, who said that he remembered Gary telling him, because Judd was working on
Yes.
Sanders as a writer at that time.
Yes.
And Judd said that Gary said, I just had the craziest pitch from Milton Berle. And then, this is just on social media, I've become friends with Mary Gross, who you'd remember from the mid-'80s, was in the cast of Saturday Night Live.
Absolutely.
During those Dick Ebersol years.
Yes.
So first with Eddie Murphy, and then with that cast with Billy Crystal and Martin Short.
Julia Louis-Dreyfus was part of that cast. Absolutely.
Exactly. Yes.
Gary Kroger, Brad Hall, Julia's.
Well, I'm glad you covered all the Chicago contingent.
Well, I had to, man. Absolutely. You got it.
Yeah. So Mary was part of that cast, and I guess she had become friends with Shandling because they'd appeared together on Comic Relief in the 80s. And so she was visiting Shandling when he was doing the Larry Sanders Show. And without knowing, she, by social media, told this story about when she was in Shandling's office. And Gary said, Milton Berle is about to pitch me an episode. Get on the other phone and just listen in. And she said that Milton and his young agent pitched this show. And I went, Mary, I was that young agent.
That's great.
So crazy, crazy small world. But yeah, those are some of my adventures with Milton.
Man, I'm so sorry Shandling didn't do that. I was at WXRT, the rock station in Chicago, and also at the sports station. And especially being part of the rock station, we all thought we were hipsters and stuff. We loved Gary. We loved Larry Sanders. I mean, we loved the Showtime show from the 80s, but we would talk about the Larry Sanders show every week after it happened the next day. And Rip Torn was performing this Horton Foote play, Young Man from Atlanta, and was doing it at the Goodman Theater.
Oh, wow.
And we're like, we got to get Artie. And his character was Artie. We're like, we have to get Artie in the station. We took him to a Bulls game, and this is when Jordan, Pippen, and Rodman. So this is the great team. Everything.
Yeah.
We had a ball, and we're like, tell us everything, and not just Larry Sanders, but we're like, tell us about Sweet Bird of Youth, the Paul Newman movie that he made, and tell us about the Cincinnati Kid. And our head sportscaster, Mike North, all he wanted to hear about was, so tell me about Summer Rental with John Candy. And Rip loved it because he's like, nobody ever asked me about these movies. That's great. So he was thrilled. He was so cool. And really, and again, I led a very Forrest Gump life. You are the king of that, but also actually working with all these amazing people. But every now and then, and also, again, obviously you teased me about mentioning the Chicago comedians. Hey, man, this is the birth of improv comedy here in Chicago.
Absolutely. No question. The Compass Players into Second City is certainly, in terms of what we now think of in that sort of tradition of improvisational comedy companies, totally all props to Chicago.
Well, and they were my heroes, and truly got the opportunity working at the sports radio station. And I won't bore you, but very quickly I'll say, did a bunch of character voices, made a bunch of song parodies, created comedy sketches to conform with whatever was happening in the Chicago sports scene at the moment. And it was a blast. And all I was doing was taking the lessons I learned, not only from the locals, but Mel Brooks and Carl Reiner and all the great sketch comedians and those great comedy albums. I appreciated stand-up, but I really love sketch. And it really, it informed a lot of my comedy sensibilities. And again, I'm a student. I always say that. It's like,
well, then this is, again, I think maybe why what we're doing on the podcast, to bring it, back to Obsessive Comedy Disorder, the podcast.
Indeed.
Found where all your fine podcasts are located. We're covering all of that. I think that sometimes the scope of what people think about when they think about comedy is very narrow. It's just stand-up, or it's just sort of proscenium-based sketch like SNL. And, I've been very fortunate in my career to work in a lot of different places. I really can't hold down a job. But one of the things that I'm probably most proud of was that when I was at IFC, got to develop and oversee the show Portlandia, and really was able to draw on all of these influences and have, very deep, philosophical conversations about comedy with that group when we were developing Portlandia and talking about Python, that's why it was so huge for me to have, John Cleese, kick off the podcast, but also Kids in the Hall as a point of reference, and Second City TV. You mentioned Summer Rental. I got to meet John Candy during my first summer interning at Paramount when he was working on Summer Rental, by the way, directed by Carl Reiner, the great Carl Reiner. And so that's when I first met John Candy. And you mentioned the Cincinnati Kid. Olin Soule, by the way, is in the Cincinnati Kid, has a scene with Edward G. Robinson in that great Paul Newman movie. But I guess the point of the podcast really was to put some frame of reference, some context around all of this comedy that you love and that I love. And look, I'll say this. I'm not on the bandwagon of people who are yelling about quote unquote cancel culture. I think that every generation has the opportunity to say, this is the world we want to live in. These are our values. And the young comics, when I was coming up, were doing that. The great comics who were, the first wave, the new wave, as I called them, were doing that. Mort Saul, Lenny Bruce, they were breaking from the values of the generation before them. Dick Gregory, these people were change makers.
Yes.
That wasn't explicitly the job. The job was to be funny, but because comedians are observers and synthesizers of where the culture is headed, they can be touchstones. And so I do believe that there is a young generation now that is doing that again. And I don't think that we can be so calcified in our beliefs as to disregard what they're saying they want to see happen in the world and the changes they want to see happen in the way we treat one another. But having said that, and this is sort of holding two ideas in your head at the same time, I still do believe that there is a way to. TMC did this thing. I thought it was fantastic. They ran a bunch of quote unquote problematic movies with these kind of roundtable discussions that they called Reframed.
Yes.
Where they tried to take a movie like Gone with the Wind, inarguably one of the classics of cinema, and said, look, here are some aspects of this movie that should be addressed, that need to be addressed, so that we can all get comfortable enough to watch this and appreciate it as cinema, but to understand these are things that probably are not going to land right now. And I think it's okay to have those conversations. I think it's necessary to have those conversations. So I just don't want to disregard anybody's feelings. I don't want to disregard progress that I always value as important and necessary. But look, this is all the stuff that I grew up on. It's important to me. And like anybody else, I don't want to be forced to let go of that stuff. So when we had the conversation with W. Kamau Bell, who I love and respect and think is so thoughtful.
Smart guy.
He really was able to articulate how he, as someone who grew up loving Bill Cosby, had to bring that to his documentary that unflinchingly dealt head on with, the wreckage that Cosby left in his wake with all of these monstrous deeds, and how, that is forever now how we must see him.
Yes.
We can't look away.
Right.
But we still have to acknowledge that part of the story is what his work both did in terms of changing comedy and changing culture, but also, frankly, what his work meant to so many of these people that he was able to prey upon, because he had this kind of not only iconic stature as a comic, but also he was this like paternal figure.
Absolutely.
And so anyway, all of that context, I think, gives us the opportunity to have a richer, fuller, more complete understanding of all of this stuff, and hopefully deepens our appreciation and facilitates the ability for us to all get in a room with each other and, you know, uh, maybe have a shared experience. So I know that sounds really lofty for a fucking comedy podcast, but it's all in the stew. It's
But
really
you're
all
right.
in the stew.
And also, I mean, again, context is important to keep in mind. And as you said, you can have two thoughts in your head that are conflicting, but both are valid. And listen, I was one of those kids, just like you were, just like Kamau was, in terms of growing up with Cosby and having this feeling, the Fat Albert cartoons. I am, as I'm sure you were, maybe your parents, my parents were part of that. I call it the cocktail generation. Louis Prima's as close as they got to rock and roll, and they were much more the Sinatra, Dean Martin kind of
Absolutely. Yeah, my mom, when my mom passed away, all of the music at her funeral was Ella Fitzgerald and Billie Holiday.
That's terrific, man. Absolutely. My dad was the same way. And they love bossa nova and things like that, Joe Beam and everything. But they had all the comedy albums. I inherited them. I listened to them. Exactly. All the Bill Cosby stuff. And I mean, literally, I saw him 4 times. The last time I saw him was literally a month on his Hello Friend tour that they had the Comedy Central special on. And also, like, a month or so after seeing him, that's when everybody started coming forward as far as the women. And it was shocking. And I took my nephews to Cosby, and they still talk about it. They're comedy nerds.
Hey, listen,
and they're
this
like, wow,
is very hard for people who loved him and loved his comedy. And, I had the experience. Bill had been very nice to me when I first started. I met him in Las Vegas when I was playing the Riviera, and he and Sammy Davis Jr. were doing a double bill at Caesars.
Wow.
And I went over and saw them do the show and hung out with them. And then years later, I was working for Carsey Werner, which was the company that had produced both of his sitcoms, the NBC one, the famous The Cosby Show, and then the later one in the 90s called Cosby for CBS.
The CBS one. Yeah.
So Carsey Werner, had this very close relationship with Bill. And so I was working at Carsey Werner, and I was at some event, and we were at the Carsey Werner table. And I said to Bill, I have tickets to come see you. And I was bringing my dad for Father's Day. And at that point, my dad was pretty ill. This was maybe, God, I want to say 2, maybe 3 at the most years before my dad passed away. But he was still sharp enough that he could appreciate, a comedy show. And again, had shared all this comedy with my dad growing up. And Bill had said, you pay full price for the ticket? I said, yeah, I did. He says, well, then come backstage. And for Father's Day, I spent an hour. This was the second show on Father's Day. So in between the first show and the second show, he came backstage, and it was me, my mom, my dad, my wife, and Bill. And Bill spent all of this time really focusing on my dad and pulling stories. My dad had served in the army during World War II. He was actually, as a Jew, he was an interpreter for Nazi POWs because my dad spoke 5, 6 different languages. And Bill was just pulling all these stories out of my dad, and my mom was sitting there weeping. And, when my mom died, this picture of me and my family with Bill Cosby was the desktop on her computer. So Bill meant a lot to me. But, when we started to all hear about this stuff and it all started coming out, I remember, I had all my signed comedy albums on the wall, and I took the Cosby album down, and I just said, I'm not judging anybody, but I can't listen to it anymore.
I understand.
To me, it was the art and the artist were the same thing. People always say, can you separate the art from the artist? And unfortunately, I think with some artists, the work is so personal, the art is who they are. And I couldn't anymore. And, that was my journey. And I couldn't uh, fault anybody, as Kamau and I had talked about. I couldn't fault anybody for whom, Cosby's work had been so personal and so integral to their childhood and their upbringing. This is separate and apart from, my experiences with Bill personally. But, I said for me, I can't revisit it. It was, it was forever poisoned, and that's not cancellation to me. I don't know what to call that, but I think that sometimes, um, not everything can stand the test of time for myriad of reasons.
Sure.
But certainly, that's a pretty extreme example for me of when, look, I don't tear pages out of history books, but some histories are, with the benefit of hindsight or more information, have to be revisited and revised.
I hear you, man, and I get it. And truly, when someone is harming other people, as Cosby did, obviously that is a bad actor that needs to be called out. I'm glad he was called out, and you're right. And now it is a much more complicated story. The concerns I have are, again, an off-color joke, a bad night, as far as a comedian goes, that gets painted with a broad brush. Or, I mean, I remember when Aziz Ansari recently was in trouble for a little while, and thankfully more of the story came out, and I think people look at what was a bad date.
I think we're all learning. I don't want to project what I believe, what I perceive onto any of these stories. I mean, look, I will say, I sort of remember, not that this always hasn't been the case, because by the way, there has always been some version of sensitivity pushing back against something, particularly in comedy. But I remember when the phenomenon of people bringing cell phone cameras into clubs sort of became this is a thing, and it was after the Michael Richards incident.
Right.
And my perception of that was not, we're seeing a racist tirade, although it was that too, but what we were seeing was somebody who, I think, my perception, was having a mental health crisis in that moment. That's what it seemed like to me. And, I don't know that Michael Richards has ever, will ever escape that incident. And that's unfortunate to me, because I do feel that in some cases there should be some ability for retribution. Some people shouldn't be put on an ice floe and sort of sent out to sea forever. And I feel bad for Michael Richards, because again, if that is was truly what it seemed to me was someone having a bad mental health moment, is that, I mean, look, there's a lot of these stories that I think could be framed that way. And I've known a lot of people in comedy who have had struggles with mental health, including my dear friend Jonathan Winters.
Yes.
He never went on a racist tirade that anyone ever captured. But, he certainly had his struggles, which he had to deal with very publicly, and I think very, very bravely. And so, look, I try and bring a lot of humanity to these conversations, and I hope we all can try and do a little bit more of that. It certainly feels like it's needed.
Understood, and I appreciate honestly the portion of this that we talked about that. But let's move on to lighter things, and I'm glad you mentioned Jonathan because God, I'm such a fan, and I'm so glad you with his daughter were able to find these incredible comic performances that had never been on albums before, and you released early. Was it earlier this year or was it last year that you released the albums, the vinyl?
It
Of
was last year in 2021, in the middle of the pandemic, for Record Store Day. And this is really kind of where the podcast began because
Really?
it's the same company. It's Nacelle,
Okay.
and their brand is Comedy Dynamics, and so Comedy Dynamics had re-released Lenny Bruce's last album, and in partnership with my dear friend Kitty Bruce. And we were all together for the grand opening of the National Comedy Center, I think in 2018, I want to say. 2018, maybe 2019. I don't exactly recall.
Is that the Jamestown Museum that Lucy, obviously is kind of the inspiration for it being in Jamestown and everything?
Right. Yes. So Lucille Ball's birthplace and her life began in Jamestown, New York, and that is why the Lucy and Desi Museum preceded the National Comedy Center, and now the National Comedy Center is there as well. And so, and Lucy Arnaz was a big part of the opening of the National Comedy Center, as were a lot of the offspring of these comic pioneers. So Kelly Carlin donated all of her father's archives, which are all housed at the National Comedy Center. So George Carlin's stuff is in the National Comedy Center. But I'm very close with Kelly and with Kitty Bruce, who I've known for many, many years. I actually met her through her grandmother, Sally Marr, Lenny's mom.
Wow.
And then I came to the grand opening because I facilitated, for the National Comedy Center, certain donations or loans from the Winters family and from Andy Kaufman's family. I'm good friends and sort of a unofficial consigliere to Michael Kaufman, Andy's kid brother.
Wow.
So they've got all this stuff from all of these people. So I was there with Lucinda and two of her kids. And Lucinda had sort of never been exposed very much to the business and sort of this whole comedy world, even though, her dad was Jonathan Winters, one of the giants of comedy. And Kitty had made this deal with Comedy Dynamics to re-release Lenny Bruce Is Out Again, and was talking about that. And then Paul Provenza and I were over at Lucinda's and going through her basement and found all of these tapes and acetates and all of this material. Much of it is still yet unreleased. But we really focused in on this period between 1958 and 1960, which is really crucial in John's history because that's when he had not one, but two very well documented breakdowns. The most famous being the first one in San Francisco when he was there at the Hungry Eye, and there was this incident at this historic ship that was there in the harbor of the Balclutha. And so by using all of this unreleased material, including this kind of beat, it's not even like a comedy record, it's this kind of like beat poetry track that he recorded for Verve and made an acetate of. We found this thing called Schizo that's on the album that had never been released before. We tried to tell the story of John confronting mental illness and used excerpts from his personal journals in the liner notes. And there were tons of references on John's first few albums. And so we got the master tape from his first album and then the uncut performance from his second album. His second album was called Down to Earth for Verve. And this performance at the Crescendo, we found the original tape where all of the references to being in the zoo and mental illness and all this stuff had actually been surgically excised from what ultimately came out on the album. We put out that full performance, and then all of this stuff like that acetate schizo. And so what this album really became was an opportunity in 3 vinyl LPs to tell a little bit of a story and give a little bit of like a more contextual snapshot of this very important period in John's work, both artistically but also personally. And look, he was an incredibly important artist to me, but he was an incredibly important human to me. I presided over 3 funerals in my life: my mom, my dad, and Jonathan Winters.
Wow.
In fact, for people, if you're going to be putting this video out, all of the art in my dining room are Jonathan's paintings and colored pencil sketches.
Wow.
So that painting right there is Jonathan's The Thoughts of a Hollywood Actor Drowning in His Own Pool. Very macabre. John's art, as his comedy was always pretty dark, but brilliant. I mean,
that's amazing, man.
It's the ideas behind the art, and I love it all so much, and I loved him so much.
Yeah.
He put it all out there, and so anyway, so we put out this album, and then I did a 2-hour audio documentary, which aired a couple of times on Sirius XM, but because Nacelle Comedy Dynamics paid for it, they held it back after it aired on Sirius XM and said, maybe you could do a podcast and we can sort of, put this back out as part of this larger podcast. So later this year, we'll have our Winter's Wonderland holiday special.
That's great.
And it will include this 2-hour special with conversations with Robert Klein, Maria Bamford, Mark Maron, and Jimmy Kimmel and his dad, Jim, all of whom I had the privilege of introducing personally to Jonathan during the last few years of John's life.
Oh, that's so, man, especially Maria Bamford, who I absolutely adore. And again, shares her own demons and would have that kind of kinship, I would imagine, with Winters. I can't wait to hear this.
Well, that was the context of my introducing them, because
certainly,
look, Maria has been so open talking about all of this stuff, but when she came out of the hospital and was on new meds and was very self-conscious and, was feeling like maybe she wasn't going to perform again, I put her on the phone with Jonathan to just talk about it. And so she and I discussed that on this special, which, like I say, we'll be putting back out as part of Obsessive Comedy Disorder, the podcast.
Indeed. Well, I again, this is so great to hear. And as I've told you in text and also the few times we talk on the phone and stuff, I'm so glad you're doing this show. Again, I think you have a great partner in Paul. And I wonder, and again, I hope it's okay that I'm taking a little bit over the hour that I promised you. Couple questions. Again, back to sketch comedy. And I love that you're talking to current people, of course. But again, being such a fan as you are of the history of comedy, would Phil Proctor, isn't Phil the only guy left from the Firesign Theater? Oh, there's another guy.
Two of 4 are still with us. Yes.
Okay. I've had the pleasure of interviewing Phil.
Phil's great. Phil's great. And in fact, when I first met Phil, all 4 of them were still around.
Wow.
And cool. I said to Phil, I would love to get you guys to sign my albums. And I have all the Firesign albums, which are absolutely groundbreaking in terms of, comedy on vinyl.
100%, man.
And really sort of pioneered a whole new era of audio comedy.
Comedy albums, absolutely, man.
Very informed by, old time radio, but for a kind of more psychedelic era.
Yes.
And then all of the stuff like the National Lampoon did on album and later on the National Lampoon Radio Hour and the Credibility Gap and Cheech and Chong and all of this stuff, I think, was incredibly influenced by the Firesign. So I gave Phil all of these albums, and they were all living in different places.
Okay.
And he, at his own expense, shipped them
Oh,
to
wow.
each of the guys. And every once in a while, I'd get an email, Peter Bergman sitting at his kitchen table signing my albums. Like, what? And so
great.
I got this box back. This is when I was living in Atlanta. I got this box back with all of my Firesign albums signed by all 4 guys.
Outstanding.
I mean, just for a nerd like me, unreasonably thrilled by that.
Well, and again, for like us comedy, like nerds and everything and snobs, and again, you grew up on the West Coast. Outside of the albums, I don't know how many, and of our generation and slightly older, people don't remember the Firesign Theater. And
I'll tell you, who's a huge Firesign fan, and we talk about the Firesign Theater, is Penn Jillette.
So well, that doesn't surprise me, but yeah.
So when you hear, and he grew up on the East Coast.
Oh, that's okay. Okay.
So yes, I had the great fortune, as I had the Credibility Gap and Dr. Demento on the radio in LA.
Yes.
We also had the Firesign. So look, I was very lucky in that way. But fortunately their stuff was preserved on vinyl, and for guys like you and Penn Jillette, those records were enough to light a spark, right?
100%, man. Again, being in the shadow of Second City here in Chicago, we had on our rock station WXRT, where I worked, a couple years before I started working there, they had a couple of guys that would produce comedy bits, and they were called The Usual Suspects, and they were veterans of Second City.
Sure.
And they were great bits, and I was so excited to work for the company. And all right, I'm here. I'm ready to do what those guys did. And it was like, yeah, we don't do that anymore. And it's like, oh, all right. But thank God the sports radio station had just started, and they were the sister station. So I got to do my lame, examples of that on there. And truly, it's, again, this is why I really appreciate audio comedy, sketch comedy, and talking about comedy on podcasts. And that's why I'm so glad you're doing the Obsessive Comedy Disorder with Paul. Also, Drew Friedman, who I'm assuming you know well, would he, not as a comedian, but generating so much great comedy material in a visual way. Yeah. I don't know. Would he be a guest on your guys' show?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Paul and I were talking about trying to get together all of the sort of, surviving members of the first class from Mad Magazine. I'm really good friends with Jay Kogan and his dad, Arnie Kogan.
Indeed.
So yes, and I mean, to use the well-worn improv axiom, yes, and I mean, Obsessive Comedy Disorder should be all things comedy. Like I say, we're doing, Bugs Bunny and cartoon voices with Eric Bauza and my interview with Mel Blanc. We've got one coming up later this month with Bruce Valanche to talk about a 45-year-old sketch album that he did with Bob Booker and George Foster. Bob Booker and George Foster produced so many famous sketch comedy albums, going back all the way back to The First Family with Vaughn Meader.
Wow.
But they did like When You're in Love, The Whole World is Jewish, which was a big album for me when I was a kid. And
come on. Irving, the 142nd fastest gun in the West.
There you go. Huge hit on the Dr. Demento show, by the way.
That's where I heard it.
Right. So Booker and Foster, their last sketch album was a gay sketch comedy album that they did with Bruce Valanche in 1977 called Out of the Closet.
Wow.
And I'd never heard Bruce talk about it. And again, as a comedy vinyl nerd, it was like, that album was groundbreaking, really groundbreaking. I mean, you really have to, and here's the thing, and because I think Bruce is he's such a great raconteur, and he remembers everything. He is a repository of show business lore and stories, and is so funny, and was able to sort of talk about his moment coming from, by the way, starting in Chicago, because, he was a journalist in Chicago when he met Bette Midler at Mr. Kelly's, and then started writing for Bette Midler. So he came out from Chicago to LA and was writing for people like Paul Lynde, who was obviously gay, but it was never textual, could never talk about it.
No.
And so, Bruce could really speak to making that album in that moment where, just at that same time, he was working with guys like Paul Lynde, who were, the generation of comedy before him, and, how comedy had been in the closet, or certainly gay comedy performers had been in the closet. And so getting the opportunity to talk to someone like Bruce Valanche about that album, I mean, that's not just a conversation about comedy. So yes, sketch and comedy albums and cartoons and Mad Magazine and Drew Friedman and, all of the great, influences, the great humor writers. I want to try and capture it all. I really want everything that brings laughter and lightness and joy to be part of this franchise. And hopefully if we keep doing it, it will be.
That's great, man. And you're right. I was so sorry. And we all were when Gilbert Gottfried passed away, because he was doing such a good job on his show.
Oh, totally.
A lot of those great comic voices alive. And
hopefully Frank will keep doing something, because Frank is so great at it.
I said, honestly, man, I bug him all the time. I'll send him messages. He was very kind and did Word Balloon years ago. But I'm like, Frank, you're so good at this. Please don't stop. But I heard him with Dana Gould. I don't know if you did on Dana's podcast. And I can appreciate he's kind of burnt out because he was doing it every week. See, I'm from radio, and literally being on air on radio 5 days a week, it's nothing for me to release several episodes a week. It's like falling out of bed. It's not a problem. But I can appreciate if you're not used to it, it can get to be a grind. Are you planning on, with Obsessive Comedy Disorder, are you going to do seasons? Are you just going to do it weekly? Do you guys have a plan as far as that goes?
You'd have to talk to the people at Nacelle and Comedy Dynamics. Right now we're sort of doing a first order, but I also, do these audio documentaries for SiriusXM.
Yes.
And so if people listening are subscribers to SiriusXM, you can go to the app, and there's a number of these, much more lavishly produced productions that I've done under the same banner, under Obsessive Comedy Disorder. There's 3 2-hour specials that are the beginnings of my trying to tell the story of the comedy boom of the 80s. There's a Grammy special that I did 3 years ago and then redid earlier this year with, Bob Newhart telling his origin story. But also people like Jim Gaffigan and Sarah Silverman and Tiffany Haddish and Lewis Black and Weird Al Yankovic, talking about the history of the Comedy Grammy Award. And then speaking of Gilbert, so when we were doing the boomers, the story of the 80s comedy boom and bust, sadly, a number of the people that we interviewed for that at length have since passed away, including Gilbert. So Provenza and I did a tribute special, the Gilbert Gottfried is Dead special, which is the entirety of our conversation, not just the little pieces that could be found in the 80s comedy boom special, but our whole conversation. And Paul and I put some frame around it because, Paul was actually really close with Gilbert. Gilbert kind of became inadvertently the star of the Aristocrats, because his very famous telling of the joke at the Hefner roast became, while Paul and Penn were in production on it, became the third act of the movie. So it was a great conversation. And the 80s comedy boom audio documentary also featured long, expansive conversations with Louis Anderson, who we've since lost, and Bob Saget, who we've since lost, both of whom were friends of mine when I was at the Comedy Store in the 80s. And then Judy Tenuta, who we just lost. By the way, Judy, Tom Dreesen, and Marsha Warfield, if you listen to the first hour of episode 3, which is really about LA, give us a running start by setting up the Chicago stand-up story.
Oh, that's great.
Sort of post, the Mr. Kelly's era of Chicago comedy,
Certainly.
when Tom Dreesen sort of became the mayor of Chicago comedy and helped start people like Marsha Warfield and Judy Tenuta, and they all tell that story. So I hope you get a chance to check that
Oh,
out.
I absolutely will. That's
Look,
amazing.
look, I'm going to keep doing this kind of stuff wherever. Not because I want to, I have to.
I'm happy.
By the way, I do think it's important to say, because sometimes people go, well, obsessive comedy disorder, you riffing on people who have OCD. I actually have OCD. So like my friend Maria Bamford, who I think, like, she titled one of her albums Unwanted Thought Syndrome, which is a particular type of OCD with intrusive thoughts. I have OCD,
Okay.
Maybe slightly less crippling, but like an utch. But doing this work is helping to scratch an itch for me, because, dude, I'm talking about this stuff, thinking about this stuff, immersed in this stuff all the time.
I'm
And
happy.
anyway, I hope for people who love it and are curious about it and want to be part of the conversation, um, come along, come on the ride. We'll hopefully, get to the thing that you love most in comedy too, eventually.
Well, in the words of Renee Zellweger and Jerry Maguire, you had me at hello, because I'm well aware of your work, and you know what you're doing. And again, as a stand-up yourself, and a guy that has produced some amazing shows, Portlandia is amazing. I hope Carrie eventually will be, and I forget her name, Slater Kinney, Carrie.
Carrie Brownstein.
Yeah, Carrie Brownstein. My God, I hope she'll be an interview subject, because I always loved her work, in Slater Kinney, and then to discover that she's such a great comedian as well. It's like,
I think she
oh
discovered
my
it too.
God.
She and Fred were making those videos together for fun. They had this site that they'd set up called Thunder Ant, which I'd seen when I was working for Turner doing digital comedy for a site called Super Deluxe
Okay.
that came and went a couple of times. I was the head of content for the original version of Super Deluxe, and I'd seen this stuff. And then when I got to IFC in 2010, my friend Andrew Singer, who is the president of Broadway Video, just sent me an email. I'd been in the job for about 3 weeks, and he said, "Do you like Fred Armisen?" I was like, "Well, who doesn't like Fred Armisen?" And he brought this up, and he and Carrie and Fred came in and pitched a very rough pencil sketch idea of what the show could be. I mean, it was basically like, well, since you're a Chicago sketch comedy aficionado, you'll get this. They said that they basically wanted to do 2 11-minute Nichols and May style improvisations in a half an hour, and that would be a show. And we said, well, that's not really a show, but we love what you guys do. And together, along with Jonathan Kreisel, who we brought in to be their showrunner and really the sort of the third head of the three-headed creative team, developed what became Portlandia. And I mean, I will tell you, probably the 2 most joyful experiences of my professional life, I would say, have been Portlandia and doing, when I was at Super Deluxe, Maria Bamford's digital series. We did a 20-episode digital series called The Maria Bamford Show. And I would say those 2 experiences, like, it's not going to get more perfect. It's not going to get more rewarding with artists whose work you love and respect, doing something that is so special. I mean, I know it's an overused word, but that's really, you hope that you get to glimpse that if you hang around long enough. And so those to me are, the tippy top shelf of, stuff that I've gotten to be, a little bit a part of.
Well, I'm hoping that Obsessive Comedy Disorder becomes has room on the shelf for that show too, and it becomes what you want it to. Hey, man, again, you guys get it, and it's very self-evident in the first 3 episodes that are already out. A 2-parter with John Cleese, then W. Kamau Bell, and looking forward to next week, and also, of course, what's coming up as far as the Jonathan Winter Wonderland. I think that's amazing. Really, Dan, there's so much more I want to talk to you about. I hope you'll come back sooner than later. Maybe early next year or something. I know we're getting into the holiday months and everything, and also today you got a house full of sick people, so I don't want to keep you longer than
I do. I live in COVID Castle, so I've already had it. So I'm staying masked when I go back upstairs.
Okay.
To tend to my loved ones, but yeah, it's no joke. I got it. I think, as I told you before we got on here, I got it at the White House Correspondents' Dinner earlier this year, where Trevor Noah joked, like, "What are we all doing here? This is going to be a super spreader event," and then it was. So
wow.
Yeah. So everybody, please be safe out there.
Absolutely, everybody, check out Dan and Paul Provenza's Obsessive Comedy Disorder podcast. Available wherever you get podcasts. It's from the Nacelle Company, Comedy Dynamics. That's Brian Volk-Weiss's company. Brian has been on the show before.
A good buddy of mine.
Well, there you go, man. And yeah, talking about the great stuff he's done with Bill Hicks's estate and all that new stuff that has been coming out lately. I feel incredibly fortunate having seen Bill Hicks in the early 90s or late 80s.
The next time I come on, I'll tell you some of my Bill Hicks stories, because I go back to the 80s with Bill.
Oh, that's great, man. And also, yeah, and I want to hear more about your stand-up adventures and truly more about the comedy album, because, again, we both grew up in that same era, and it is so interesting now seeing this evolution of where comedy is online, and it's kind of replaced what, was great about the comedy albums when we were kids, and it's always fascinating. I'm halfway through Mort Saul biography and just enjoying it, really.
We have a Mort Saul episode coming up, so this will be of interest then. So I actually got to interview Mort for a documentary that, if you haven't seen it, would certainly be of interest to you. It was about the Chicago nightclub Mr. Kelly's. And so David Marienthal, who is the son of one of the founders and co-owners of Mr. Kelly's, produced this documentary called Live at Mr. Kelly's.
Yes.
And I went up to Marin County and conducted what I believe was the last long-form interview with Mort. And my deal with them was, whatever you don't use in the movie, I get to use. And they were like,
great.
Fine. So we take that interview, and Paul and my friend Cliff Nestoroff, who, if you don't know Cliff, wrote the book The Comedians,
yes,
which is really one of the definitive comedy history books. He's a terrific writer, and as a Canadian, he likes to proudly say that he is America's foremost comedy authority. I will cede that to him. So anyway, so Paul, Cliff, and I talk about Mort, and then listen to big hunks of this conversation I had with Mort, and that episode will be part of this first group of episodes of Obsessive Comedy Disorder, the podcast.
Well, fans of Word Balloon know I'm a massive comedy history fan, and Cliff has been on the show, as I mentioned.
Oh, good. Yeah,
when the book came out, he did the show. So yeah, I love this stuff, and we need this, because, again, the history of comedy is so fascinating, and it's great that you and Paul are putting your spin on it and providing these interviews and stuff. So I can't recommend Obsessive Comedy Disorder more than just what you've heard in this last hour or so. So, Dan, truly, thanks a lot for coming on. I'm going to wrap things up now and tell everybody thank you very much for watching, and more great Word Balloon Live coming up. And certainly we'll dip into comedy every now and then, but also have fun with, comic books and the other aspects of pop culture. So until then, stay safe, stay happy, stay healthy.